We are all taught the same story in school. We are told that the First World War, the catastrophe that broke the spine of the 20th century, began with 2 bullets fired in Sarajevo. We are told it was a tragic accident of alliances. We are told it was the assassination of an Archduke set off a chaotic chain reaction that no one actually wanted. But this is the version of history written for children. It is a convenient fairy tale that ignores the cold, hard mathematics of empire. If you truly want to understand why millions of young men died in the mud of the trenches and why the map of the Middle East looks the way it does today, you have to look past the assassination. You have to look past the Archduke. You have to look at a map of the world in the year 1000, and you must find the one thing that terrified the British Empire more than any army, more than any navy, and more than any weapon ever invented. It was not a bomb, it was a train line. This is the untold story of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It is the story of an iron road that promised to connect the industrial heart of Europe directly to the oil fields of the Middle East, bypassing the British chokehold on global trade. It is the story of how the Ottoman Empire tried to escape the financial slavery of London and Paris, only to walk straight into a trap that would erase it from existence. To understand the world we live in today, from the wars in Iraq to the tensions in the South China Sea, we must first understand how the British Empire destroyed the world just to stop one single train. To understand this tragedy, we must first step back into the world as it existed at the turn of the 20th century. It was a world entirely different from our own, yet driven by the exact same hunger for power. The British Empire was the undisputed master of the globe. Its power was not just military, it was logistical. It rested on 2 pillars. The first was the Royal Navy, which controlled every major ocean shipping lane on the planet. The second was the Suez Canal in Egypt. The Suez Canal was the lifeline of the empire. It was the jugular vein of the global economy. It was the only way to quickly reach India, the crown jewel of the British system. As long as Britain controlled Suez, they controlled who could trade with the East. If you were a German merchant, a Russian trader, or an Italian manufacturer, and you wanted to send goods to India or China, you had to pass through British checkpoints. You had to play by British rules. You existed at their mercy. But in the heart of Europe, a new power was rising, one that threatened to shatter this monopoly. Germany, unified in 1871, had become an industrial titan almost overnight. By 1900, German factories were outproducing British factories. German science was the envy of the world. German engineering was unmatched. But Germany had a fatal problem. They had no empire. They had no massive colonies to provide cheap raw materials. And worst of all, they had no navy that could challenge the British. Germany was a giant, but a giant trapped in a cage. It was surrounded by rivals in Europe and cut off from the global markets by the steel wall of the British fleet. They needed a way out. They needed a back door to the world.
At the same time, to the southeast, lay the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Ottomans had been a superpower, the gatekeepers between East and West. But by the late 19th century, they were known with pity and contempt as the sick man of Europe. The empire was rotting from the inside. They had lost vast territories in the Balkans. Their army was outdated, their administration corrupt. But their biggest problem was not soldiers, it was debt. The Ottoman government was drowning in loans owed to British and French banks. In 1881, the empire had essentially gone bankrupt. To pay back their creditors, they were forced to surrender control of their own economy to a humiliating organization called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was not a government agency. It was a board of European bankers who literally collected the taxes from Ottoman citizens. If a Turkish farmer sold salt or silk or tobacco, the tax money did not go to the Sultan in Constantinople. It went directly into a bank vault in London or Paris. The empire had become a colony in everything but name. The Sultan at the time, Abdul Hamid II, was desperate. He knew his empire was being eaten alive by foreign capital. He needed a way to modernize his country and defend his crumbling borders without relying on the very people who were robbing him. He needed infrastructure. He needed a railway that could move troops from Constantinople to the desert frontiers in days rather than months. But he knew that if he asked the British or the French to build it, they would just use it to tighten their grip around his throat. This is where the interests of Germany and the Ottoman Empire collided in a perfect storm. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, saw an opportunity that would change the balance of power forever. The plan was audacious in its scale and simplicity. If Germany could build a railway connecting Berlin to Constantinople, and then extend that railway all the way to Baghdad and eventually to the Persian Gulf, they could bypass the British Empire entirely. Think about the geometry of this. It was a revolution in geography. A train loaded with German steel, chemicals, or machinery could leave Berlin, travel through Vienna, cross the Balkans, enter Turkey, and travel all the way to the Indian Ocean without ever seeing a British ship, without ever paying a British tax, without ever asking for British permission. It would create a massive overland trade route that the Royal Navy could not touch. It would unite the industrial muscle of Germany with the resource wealth of the Middle East. For the Sultan, it was a lifeline of independence. For Germany, it was a path to world power. But for Britain, it was a nightmare. Construction began with German financing and German engineers. The Deutsche Bank, the massive financial institution, took the lead. The engineering was a miracle of its time. They had to blast tunnels through the Taurus Mountains, bridge mighty rivers, and lay tracks across scorching deserts where no machine had ever gone before. As the tracks moved east, kilometer by kilometer, panic began to set in London. The British strategic planners looked at the map and they didn't see a train. They saw a dagger pointed at the heart of their empire. If the railway was completed, German troops could threaten the Suez Canal within days. German merchants could flood the markets of India with cheap goods, bankrupting British industry. But there was something else, something even more dangerous than trade, something that would define the next century of human history.
Oil. At this precise moment in history, a technological revolution was taking place in the navies of the world. For a century, ships had been powered by coal, but coal was heavy, dirty, and inefficient. The British had discovered that oil burned hotter and cleaner. It allowed ships to travel faster, accelerate quicker, and stay at sea for weeks without refueling. Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, and Admiral Fisher, the head of the Royal Navy, made a fateful decision. They decided to convert the entire British fleet from coal to oil. They knew that in the next war, speed would be survival. But Britain had a catastrophic problem. They had plenty of coal in Wales, but they had absolutely no oil on their own island. They were an empire running on a fuel they did not possess. They relied entirely on supplies from Persia and the United States. Geologists were just beginning to realize that the land the Baghdad Railway would cross, the territory of Mesopotamia, which we now call Iraq, was sitting on an ocean of oil. The Germans had shrewdly secured the mineral rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the railway track. This meant that if the train was finished, Germany would not just control the trade route, they would control the tap that fueled the future of warfare. They would control the very blood that the British Navy needed to survive. The equation in London changed instantly. The railway was no longer just a commercial threat, it was an existential threat. The British establishment decided that this railway could not be allowed to reach the sea. They used every weapon in their arsenal to stop it. First, they used diplomacy as a weapon. They pressured the Sheikh of Kuwait, a small territory at the very end of the proposed line, to sign a secret agreement with Britain. The Sheikh agreed not to lease any land to foreign powers without British permission. This effectively blocked the railway from having a terminal on the Persian Gulf. It was a strategic checkmate that left the railway leading to nowhere. Then they weaponized the press. British newspapers began a massive propaganda campaign against the Ottoman Empire. They painted the Ottomans as barbarians and accused the Germans of supporting tyranny. They reframed the railway not as a project of economic development, but as a tool of oppression and German expansionism. Finally, they used finance. The City of London, the financial heart of the world, refused to allow any British capital to invest in the project. They tried to starve the railway of cash. But the Germans kept building. By 1914, the rails had reached the mountains of southern Turkey. The project was nearly complete. The gap was closing. It is in this context, and only in this context, that we must view the outbreak of World War I. The tensions between the great powers were not just about national pride or border disputes in Europe. They were about who would control the economic future of the world. The Triple Entente, the alliance between Britain, France, and Russia, was formed specifically to encircle Germany and stop its expansion. Russia feared the railway would strengthen the Ottomans, France feared German economic dominance, and Britain feared for India, Suez, and the oil. When the war finally started in 1914, the first place the British military looked was not Berlin. It was not the Western Front. It was the Middle East. The tragedy for the Ottoman Empire was that they had tried to use the rivalry between Europe's powers to save themselves, but they ended up being crushed between them. They joined the war on the side of Germany, hoping that a German victory would free them from their debts. They hoped the railway would bring German guns to help them retake their lost lands. But they had miscalculated the ruthless determination of the British Empire. The British were not fighting just to defeat an army, they were fighting to secure an asset. As soon as the war began, a British expeditionary force was landed at Basra in southern Iraq. Their mission was ostensibly to protect the oil refinery at Abadan, but their real goal was to march north. They were following the path of the unfinished railway. They were moving to secure the oil fields of Mosul and Kirkuk before the Germans could get there. The war in the Middle East was brutal and often ignored in history books. While soldiers in Europe died in mud, soldiers in Mesopotamia died of heat stroke, cholera, and thirst. The British suffered humiliating defeats like the Siege of Kut, where an entire British army was surrounded and forced to surrender to the Ottomans. But the British had the world's resources behind them, and the Ottomans were running on empty. The railway that was supposed to save them was not finished. There were critical gaps in the tracks through the mountains. Supplies from Germany had to be unloaded, carried by truck or camel over the passes, and then reloaded onto trains. This bottleneck strangled the Ottoman war effort.
If the railway had been finished 5 years earlier, the war might have ended very differently. But the delay allowed the British to regroup, push north, and eventually capture Baghdad and Jerusalem. As the war dragged on, the British and French governments met in secret to decide the fate of the Ottoman Empire. They didn't even wait for the war to end. In 1916, two diplomats named Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot sat down with a map and a pencil. They drew lines across the Middle East that ignored tribal boundaries, religious sects, and geography. But if you look closely at the Sykes-Picot map, you will see something chilling. The lines correspond almost perfectly to the proposed route of the Baghdad Railway and the known locations of oil deposits. Britain claimed the southern part of Iraq and the port of Haifa in Palestine. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. They were carving up the carcass of the empire to ensure that no single power could ever threaten their dominance again. The railway that was meant to unite the region became the knife that divided it. The betrayal was total. The British had promised the Arabs independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. T.E. Lawrence, known to the world as Lawrence of Arabia, led these revolts, blowing up the very railway lines that the Ottomans relied on. He told the Arabs they were fighting for freedom, but he was unknowingly fighting for British oil interests. When the war ended, the Arabs did not get their freedom. They got British and French colonial rule. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved, the Sultan was deposed, the Caliphate was abolished, and the debt? The debt was not forgiven. It was merely restructured to be paid by the new artificial nations carved out of the empire. The British Empire had succeeded. They had stopped the German threat, they had secured the route to India, and most importantly, they had seized the oil that would power the 20th century. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was cut into pieces. Different sections were now in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. It never functioned as the unified trade route it was designed to be. The dream of a Silk Road of steel was dead. The destruction of the Ottoman Empire and the failure of the Baghdad Railway left a vacuum in the Middle East that we are still dealing with today. The borders they drew created new obstacles. A train traveling from Baghdad to Europe now had to cross 3 different customs borders, deal with 3 different currencies, and navigate 3 different colonial administrations. This was intentional. The colonial powers preferred a divided Middle East that was weak and dependent to a united one that could challenge them. But the story does not end in 1918. In fact, the ghost of that railway has returned with a vengeance in the 21st century. Today, we have a new rising industrial power that is challenging the dominant naval empire. China is the new Germany, the United States is the new British Empire, and the Belt and Road Initiative is the new Baghdad Railway. Just like the Kaiser Wilhelm, the Chinese leadership realizes that they are vulnerable at sea. The U.S. Navy controls the shipping lanes of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In the event of a war, the U.S. could blockade China and starve its economy of energy. So, China is building massive infrastructure projects across the Eurasian continent, high-speed rail lines, pipelines, and highways that connect China to Europe and the Middle East overland. Look at the map of the Belt and Road. It looks almost exactly like the map of the Baghdad Railway, but on a much larger scale. It seeks to bypass the choke points controlled by the American Navy. It seeks to unite the economies of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East into a single trading bloc. And just like the British in the 1900s, the Americans are reacting with anxiety. We see the same headlines, we hear the same accusations of debt traps and supporting dictators. The language has barely changed in 100 years because the strategic reality hasn't. The story of the Baghdad Railway teaches us a brutal lesson about geopolitics. It teaches us that when a declining empire feels threatened by an infrastructure project that could undermine its hegemony, it will lash out. It will use financial warfare, propaganda, and eventually military force to stop the connection from being made. The Middle East is once again the chessboard where this game is being played. The wars, the instability, the shifting alliances, they are all happening along the exact same fault lines where those rails were laid a century ago. We are told that history is about ideologies or religions or the clash of civilizations. But if you dig down through the sand and the history books, you hit the rusted iron tracks of a German railway that was never finished. You find the remnants of a business deal that went wrong. You find the proof that the borders of the Middle East were not drawn to create nations, they were drawn to stop a train. The world we live in, the wars we fight, and the prices we pay were all shaped by the failure of the Baghdad Railway. The train that never arrived is still destroying the world. Only those who pay attention to the maps of the past can see the tracks leading into our future.